The Silicon Valley Tech Talk Lounge is a show where we invite guests working here in the Bay Area to talk about their work, its impact, and their insights on current news and events. In today's episode, our guest is Mr. Christopher Kuzmo. Mr. Kuzmo is currently a computer science teacher at Palo Alto High School. Sounds good. And
Yeah.
so I just want to give a quick introduction of you before we start the show. And
Okay.
Our guest today is Mr. Chris Kuzmo. Mr. Kuzmo holds a computer science degree and computer science and engineering degree from MIT and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He wrote some of the earliest code for internet search and image processing on high-performance computers and has worked for startup companies in areas of parallel computing network routing, digital transaction security, and deep web page analysis. Mr. Kuzmo began teaching at Pali in 2009 and has mentored or taught more than a dozen world champions in the area of robotics, mathematical modeling, leadership, and pure mathematics. He served as president at a Kiwanese chapter. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Kiwanis.
Okay.
Sorry.
Kiwanis chapter PTA and a chapter of Computer Science Teachers Association. He has also served on the CSTA National Standards Committee. Mr. Kuzmo pioneered the Stanford formal logic curriculum at the secondary level and created and taught the first professional development seminars in formal logic at Stanford AI Lab and Stanford's Center for Excellence in Teaching. Through the Microsoft TOS program, Mr. Kuzmo led more than a dozen high school students, more than 24 high schools across the state of Washington in delivering computer science. This included a substantial remote instruction program. He has presented, inspected, and judged for FIRST Robotics at the regional and national level and is expected to join the Webster Regional Robotics Forum Board of Directors in June 2020. Currently, Mr. Kuzmo is my APCS teacher at Palo Alto High School. So I guess a good starting point would be just we've talked a little bit about your work prior to coming to Pali, and I was wondering if you could go a little bit more in depth with what you did.
Well, so I've kind of someone my age has had multiple lives, but when I graduated from college back in the 80s, I went and worked for what's called a Beltway Bandit just outside of Washington, D.C. And that's a company that fulfills contracts for the U.S. government. In this case, it was for sort of technical oversight of major endeavors that were pursued by the government, such as launching satellites and launching any kind of spacecraft to go anywhere. And so there were the breadth of technical knowledge at that particular company. It was a small company; it's about 100 or 200 people, but amongst them there was the expertise to basically put a person on the moon. And so it was a great learning experience for me. And then from there, I had a girlfriend who was a student at MIT, and she got into graduate school at Stanford. And so I came out to Silicon Valley and worked for a startup company for a couple of years. And like most startup companies, that failed. And then so then things got a little bit confused, or a little bit varied, because I went kind of simultaneously, went to work for NASA, went to graduate school at the University of Illinois, and went to the former Soviet Union when my wife became a Fulbright lecturer. and so I spent some time in the former Soviet Union where I got most of my stories, and that was my good stories. And then from there, I came back and worked for NASA for several more years, basically the rest of the 90s, and rose to be a senior research scientist for the contracting company whose name was Computer Sciences Corporation. And around the year 2000, more or less 2001, went to work for another startup company, which also failed. These things happen. Basically, that's what startup companies do almost always, is fail. But that was sort of a transitional opportunity for our family, because then my wife, when that startup company failed, we agreed that my wife would work full time, and I would take care of the kids. And that caused me to focus my attention on the community and the schools. And that's sort of where I became a PTA president for a couple of years, when there's all kinds of stories from that time. And I was a Kiwanis Club chapter president. And I finally decided, after being involved with the schools and the community as a volunteer and as a parent, as sort of a leader of nonprofits and that sort of thing, that the thing to do is to actually become a teacher. And so I kind of finally bit the bullet around 2008 and started doing the things you have to do to get credentialed. And in late 2009, I became a credentialed teacher. Maybe early 2010, something around 2009 or 10. I'm not sure what the actual date is on the official documents. And then from that point forward, I was a professional full-time teacher, and the vast majority of that in teaching at Pali, and teaching in more or less the role that I'm in now.
Okay, and all of the works that you were in, you were primarily focused on the software side of things.
I would say that's accurate. Yeah.
And something I'm quite curious about is, you said that you worked in a lot of the companies that a lot of the startups that ended up failing, and you wrote some of the earliest codes for things like for many of the things that we take for granted today, like you said parallel computing, network routing, digital transaction security, and deep web page analysis. And
Yeah.
if you kind of compare the level of sophistication of those technologies now and how complex they are, or how much they have changed, do you feel that there's a huge change between now and when it was first successfully developed?
Well, complexity comes in different forms. And so there are refinements that make it so that something that works as a sort of a research project.
I think we are losing a bit of connection here.
Now I would say there's a lot more sort of standard processes for how to create a piece of software that will robustness, and which can involve the work of more than one person. In other words, working groups. Things the concepts behind GitHub, for example, are 10 years ago it was uncommon for even industry professionals to be that familiar with it. I mean, at that point they did. 20 years ago, it was uncommon. And you certainly 20 years ago wouldn't have even thought of having students using GitHub. 10 years ago, it was novel for have students using GitHub. Now, everyone uses GitHub.
Yeah.
And so that's just one example of an increasing level of understanding and literacy throughout the population for how to use a particular technology, that in turn makes it so that the software that you produce is more mature earlier, and it can be developed by more people. So I would say that that's the main source of increased sophistication. But the complexity in terms of how hard did you have to think about solving a problem? You had to think harder in some ways, back in 1990 because there weren't any of these tools or concepts at your disposal. You had to come up with them on your own.
And for startups nowadays, do you feel that they've kind of moved on to newer fields, or have they been both moving on to newer fields, but at the same time refining the ones that that you've worked on? Was it like 20
Um,
30 years, 30 to 40 years ago, right?
well,
Oh
yeah, I
no.
mean, so the first startup I worked for in 1988, which is what, 32 years ago. And the last startup that I personally have worked for was in 2006, which was still 14 years ago. Now, I've also seen colleagues and students and my son all work for startup companies in that 14-year time. It's a slightly different perspective, but I still think I have an idea of how these things have changed. And I would say that a couple of the things. So one of the fun facts from 1988 was when you started a startup company, and if you told an investor that your startup company was focusing on software, they wouldn't give you nearly as much financing. They wouldn't be nearly as confident in your business as if you were saying that you were actually going to build a physical piece of hardware, like a physical computer, for example. That was so that was something which even then you could tell was going to change. But for the people who were the leaders of the company, who were at the time were in their 50s or 60s, people that were at that time my age now, and I was more like your age, a little older, but basically your age.
Uh-huh.
And so in 1988, I was like, "Come on, software is going to be the thing." But they were like, "We can't get money to develop software. We have to develop hardware." And so that's completely different now. So that now, of course, if you're building an app and it's promising, then you can get financing for it. And if you're building hardware, people are looking at it sketchily, like, "Wait a minute, are you going to be able to afford to support the development costs for hardware,
Right.
uh,
Right.
and be able to overcome the fact that can be rapidly the competition can rapidly outsource the hardware out of the country and make it so that your business is undermined by that."
Yeah.
So it's that particular concept has been sort of turned around. There's other issues of how startup companies are managed and led. That's changed a little bit, but not that much, I don't think.
And the thing with software is that it could be infinitely produced without increasing or even slightly increasing the cost, because it's so easy to just duplicate the software over and over again, and hardware costs a lot more to produce.
Yeah, there is the margins for software are fantastic. Uh, I think in both, whether you're talking about in 1988 or you're talking about now, the rationale for the valuation was more in terms of what could a competitor do. And so in 1988, people thought, well, your competitor can just copy your software, right?
Right.
Now the intellectual property protections for software are more well established. They're not perfect, but people know what they are, right? So that it's less likely someone will just steal your software willy-nilly. And meanwhile, the capacity to outsource or otherwise automate the creation of hardware now is much easier than it was then. So it's all about what can your competitors do.
Uh-huh. And yes, and you talked about this a little bit before, but what was your transition from working startups to teaching like?
All right. So first of all, for the full disclosure, I didn't work startups all the time. I was most of the time that before I was an educator, I was I was in some capacity with NASA and ultimately a senior research scientist. But I certainly worked for startups a few times. And so the transition was, first I was working at NASA, doing fine, but frankly a little bored, a little feeling like I wasn't
Uh-huh.
learning anything anymore. And I wanted to do something that would push myself. And so a friend of mine who was part of a startup company invited me to join their company, and I did. And of course, pretty quickly, the economy had big problems that were out of our control, and we went out of business because our product was good, but all of our customers went out of business. And so
Oh,
no matter how good your product, if you don't have any customers, you're going out of business too. And so we did. And so that left me kind of sitting at the kitchen table with my wife saying, well, what are we going to do? Because I could have gone and searched and found another engineering job somewhere.
right.
But the economy wasn't doing so well at the time. It would have been tricky for me to find a position that was very enjoyable, very rewarding. Um, Meanwhile, she was having a lot of success at work, but she was only working half time because she was the primary caregiver for our children. And so the solution was pretty obvious: have her go from half time to full time in a job she already loved, and they already loved her. And then let me, I might consult a little bit here and there, but mostly I would take care of the kids. And then we did that transition, and so I got to walk my children to school for most of their elementary school career, and well, pretty much all of their elementary school career. And my wife got to become a highly successful Silicon Valley technical leader, and so that now she's a principal scientist at Adobe.
And when was this period? Was it in the early 2000s, just before you started teaching?
Yeah, so that transition happened. I don't remember exactly. I think it was like early 2002 when, when I stopped working for the last startup company that I was a full-time, fully paid employee for. There were a couple more startup companies that I worked for after that, but they never didn't get big enough to pay me, or the arrangement was temporary enough that I wasn't an employee but was just a consultant. But in any case, yeah, it was about 2002 that I went to becoming a stay-at-home dad, and then took care of the kids and stuff. And taking care of the kids got easier as time went on. And so sometime around 2005 or so, or even earlier, I joined the Kiwanis. Oh, actually, I ran for city council. I forgot about that. I ran for city council in the city of Mountain View in 2002. Lost. And that was good, because if you're on city council, it's really bad for your health. I mean, I think those people, it's a big sacrifice just to have to sit at the table in the front of the room for 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours every week or so. And it's just, you can just see them. They just, I mean, as much as they take care of themselves, otherwise, you just look worse and worse if you're sitting up there like that. And so I was glad to not have become a city councilor, and worked to support the community by joining the Kiwanis Club and becoming the president of that organization, and joining the PTA and becoming the president of that organization. So that covered about 3 years, during which I or more than 3 years, at least 3 years, where I kind of went from interested in supporting the community to really involved in supporting the community. And seeing where the need was, and realizing that it seemed to me the biggest way I could make a difference that I would also find personally rewarding would be to be a teacher. And so I began that transition in 2008.
Okay. Did you feel that there was anything that you've learned from your previous work that you were able to apply to working teaching?
Yes, but also no. So the world of teaching and the world of engineering, the world of education and the world of science and engineering have very different cultures. And that means that you have an advantage, because if you're a scientist or an engineer, in terms of your understanding and training, in terms of understanding how it is that new ideas come to actually work. And how is it that you get someone to come up with a good new idea? How is it that you get someone to work really hard, even though you don't have grades to hold over their head, but instead you just have the ability to make them enthusiastic? And that's running volunteer organizations also helped in this regard. And so that experience made it so that I relative to other teachers with my level of experience, was able to quickly get students to do more ambitious things successfully. It also produced complications, um, but, uh, but because the two worlds are so different. But that, yeah, there was that kind of advantage of really understanding what innovation is and how it works.
Okay, I see. And moving on to this year, um, something that I also wanted to talk about is what were some of the things that you were doing to for this year help students learn remotely, and how's that different from previous years teaching at Pali? Because traditionally you would just teach students every 2 to 3 days in a classroom for 1.5 hours, and now it's everything's moved online. What were some of the things that you were using?
Yeah, well, so doing the transition, I was a little lost at first. I think we as an organization, the school and the district,
Mhm.
lost an opportunity when we saw the virus coming. Um, and there were some people who were sort of advocating for really trying to make it so that we could uh, be ready for closure. And I think there was a lot of denial that closure would happen until suddenly closure happened. Um, and so that made it so that I think we lost a lot of momentum in terms of what we could have done to get ready. Uh, Given that, I was nevertheless able to kind of ultimately produce a set of comprehensive videos that covers the curriculum for all the computer science classes. And for the engineering and CAD classes, I had to scale back. It's kind of hard to know. I mean, how do you teach something which is fundamentally a hands-on activity when you're not can't and fundamentally can't be physically present for with the materials for the students, or to keep an eye on them for purposes of safety. Teaching engineering was something that I mean, I now have some ideas for, but it will take some time to kind of get it together, and just coming up with it in the moment was not something that I could think of how to do. And
Okay.
so I settled on creating some assessments for students to use in reference to a decent set of CAD videos I found.
Okay.
And that made it so that at least they had something to kind of do, to kind of learn about, something systematic. In some ways, that might have actually been better for some of the students in that particular situation than because it provided sort of, I got less ambitious with that class. And sometimes when you get less ambitious with the class, you actually cause the students are actually able to pick up more because you're just focusing on the basics.
Right, that makes sense. So it was all kind of a very sudden process. It just suddenly, before you guys even started thinking about moving school to online, it just one day you guys just are within a week, or when did you guys start planning to move school online for Pali?
So at some point in time, one of the teachers in my department sent an email off to the other teachers in the department and said, "Hey, why don't we get ready for the possibility of needing to close down?" And I thought that was a great idea. And I said, "Well, okay, I'll do something to kind of start to prepare, and we'll uh, actually have the students not come into the classroom for one day,
Mhm.
see what comes up." Because you cannot, this is one
Right.
of the things I learned from industry, you
Uh-huh.
cannot figure out how to do something new unless you actually do it.
Right. Yeah.
um,
Okay.
and the good news is, if you're doing it while we're still meeting at the school, you can bring people back and talk about it and quickly kind of fix up the mistakes and confusion that happened. And for
Mhm.
example, you yourself personally, I know you got confused about something about that day, and
Yeah.
we and we had to, and it was good that we could actually talk about it in person rather than you being off somewhere lost and not knowing what you were supposed to do.
Uh-huh.
We kind of got that fixed up.
Mhm.
And but nevertheless, but because the school, well, here's the thing: there's leadership in times of crisis, and there's leaderships when there's not crisis. And they're two different kinds of leadership. And it's difficult to function as a leader in a crisis if your style is, or organizationally function in a time of a crisis when your organization is organized around sort of more routine day-to-day activities. And so the routine day-to-day question of what rules are we following with respect to online learning, there were a set of rules that to do what I was trying to do, we couldn't follow. And so my attitude was, hey, it's a pandemic. We gotta adjust to it. But there was a little bit of I would say a lack of imagination in terms of how to address that problem until suddenly the school was closed. And at that point, it was like, oh, well, now teach things online. It's like,
yeah.
Now it's a situation where you've lost a lot of time, a lot of opportunity. You can still do things, but it's difficult when one element of human motivation is that once you've had a responsibility taken away from you, it's hard to regain momentum. So that was.
Do you think there was any benefit to learning online? Was there anything that's good about it compared to just doing it face to face?
Well, I think in a way, but in a way that's very expensive in terms of the harm to the students. It's sort of like saying, well,
right,
here's what we're going to do. We're going to make it so only 5 of your students can make it into the classroom, and only your 5 best students to make it into the classroom. Well, guess what? Those 5 students are going to get a better learning experience. And so the students who typically I was able to reach out to and were able to reach out to me were students who were highly capable. And so it was more difficult to reach out to the students who were in more need of support, because they would frequently be the reason they needed more support was typically because they were operating in more challenging circumstances from home. And so there's a strong correlation between these two things. And so the students who most need support aren't even getting anything. They're not asking for anything. You don't know what's going on. You're sending them an email and you don't get responses. And so those students, because at a certain point you try to support them, and you don't support, but we haven't figured out how to do that. And so that's a huge cost. It's a huge societal cost to give up on that. And then there is a small silver lining, and that is I have more time. Okay, I have more time for strong students. So a strong student sends me a question,
right.
I have the time to answer it fully. And for me personally, it's nice to be able to sit here and think about a problem and write up an answer and make a video about it. And I can do that and I don't get interrupted. Maybe I get emails, but I don't have to let those interrupt me, unlike in the classroom where people will be constantly interrupting you. And so the smaller level of interruptions has been very pleasant for me in terms of my personal experience. But as I said, I think that advantage comes at a huge price.
Right.
So I don't feel comfortable characterizing it as an advantage of going online. I would just call it more of a silver lining.
Yeah, that is a very valid concern, because most of the time, if you have a student that's struggling and not really asking for help, and you're just sitting very close to the student inside of a classroom, you could just go up and ask the student how he or she's doing, and try to provide some help. But now everything's online. It's making it really hard to contact students.
Yeah. Even in person, it's difficult, right? Even in person, you find yourself overlooking a student who maybe you should pay more attention to. But at least they're there. At least you have some chance of making the connection. And and there's also what we call latency. How long? So if I see a student's having a problem, I'm going to understand that it is how significant the problem is within seconds if I actually follow up with them in person. Within a few seconds, I'm going to know, oh, this student needs more follow-up. On the other hand, if there's a student who I don't know what's going on with them, I send them an email, and then a day later I get nothing back. Okay, it's been a day. Okay. And the
Yeah.
amount of time between when I first suspect there's a problem and actually we can do something about it, that can drag on for a week or two or three. And the semester melts away and the student has lost the opportunity to be, they're hopelessly behind in the class unless you adjust the class's standards. And so that's part of the reason why there's a big back off on the assignment requirements. And I've been extremely willing to push almost automatically. I will give extensions to people because it's just not possible to be remotely fair. But there's another element of unfairness here, where students who want to get a rigorous education, they do all the work to be on time, and then all these deadlines get pushed out another 5 weeks or something. What work are they going to have to do, and what credit are they going to get in recognition for all the effort that they put in to get those assignments done on time? And so it's very difficult to be fair by almost any measure when you're in this situation. As time goes on, we might be able to figure out some measures and mechanisms for making it more fair and making it more, at the same time, rigorous. But just doing it doing it ad hoc, doing it on the fly, has been very difficult to meet all the interests that need to get served when you're doing education.
So do you think that the future of education is technology? Because a lot of both students and teachers are saying there are a lot of benefits to using online resources, like for people that are not really that don't traditionally have access to resources. They will be able to get more access online.
I can't speak to the general situation. I know that in my personal experience, I've become more adept at making instructional videos for my students. And in the process, I have created a library of videos that I can now use in future classes. That makes it so that I will be able to support online classes more readily in the future. And it makes it so that I'll be able to take advantage of technologies that interface with an online experience more readily. So those are sort of positives. And in terms of which technologies will make sense, I think that, so it has been possible to give some semblance of the current experience all the way back to the late 1960s, 69, and you could mail them to people and people could watch them and learn just as well as if you go on YouTube now and watch a video. So the question is, what's in those 50 years since then, since it's been possible, what difference is there? And I would say there's very little difference. There is, and we have not seen this technology take strong hold in the world of education. And I would say the fundamental reason is that we still are not far enough along in terms of what's called bandwidth and latency. The time it takes to get a response from a student, the amount of information that you can get about a student's situation and learning is still very small, because you see them in 3D when they're in the classroom, and there's a lot of detail of information about how a student is doing that doesn't have anything to do with what they're typing at the moment. Okay, it has to do with their posture. It has to do with what you put up on the walls in the classroom. And so, I guess I would say that fact driven home to me reminds me of the need as teacher, when I have a classroom, how can I take advantage of it? I'm going to be more mindful of taking more advantage of my classroom if and when I get one back. But until we're able to get the bandwidth for communications higher and cheaper, so that you can project a whole scene on all your walls and make it so you really are immersed, have an immersive virtual reality experience, then I don't think technology is going to replace the classroom very effectively.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. Oh, I was also curious about your thoughts on your thoughts on programming as teaching programming as a class, because many people are saying that we should, instead of making high school students uh, take programming classes as an elective, we should make it mandatory. What do you think? What do you think about that? Do you think that's something that we should do, or not necessarily?
Because the students who need to learn computer science are often those who will avoid it. So that situation calls for a requirement. However, in my opinion, the best solution eliminates half of the current requirements and injects computer science more fully into math and laboratory science and engineering classes. And in this way, all students would get computer science through required courses, but enrollment of pure computer science would be enhanced because students would have more room in their schedules. And I think that it would, the fundamental explanation I get for why students don't enroll in computer science is not because it's merely an elective, but because they don't have room to fit it into their schedules. So we could force them to have it in their schedules, but that would still make it the case that students would only take one semester and only do it with a minimum of enthusiasm. And I'm not happy about the idea of having students who are just there to get through the class. I
Uh-huh.
far prefer to have students who want to take the class.
Right, but almost.
So yeah,
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, that's I was just going to say it's difficult to predict the effect of a policy decision, and it's valuable to make decisions in a dynamic way that allows and expects a change in the requirements over time. I think it's hard though, because human nature tends to want a decision, make it a requirement, don't make it a requirement, and then not change that. And I wish we were able to be more flexible.
But what if you change it to almost like a core class where you have kind of similar as English, math, and the sciences? You would have English, math, science, and programming.
Right. So I think it goes back to the question of there's only so much time in the day. And so if you're going to make it a requirement, you're going to have to either diminish the number of electives down to practically zero, or you're going to have to remove some other class from being a requirement. And so which of those will work? Which of those is the best choice? I don't know. I think that there are, and I mean, I was on a computer science advisory committee for the school district for 3 years, and we struggled to come up with a good recommendation for the district, and ultimately did recommend making computer science a requirement, at which point the district promptly decided not to take the advice. So I don't know what to recommend at this point for the community, other than what I said, which is sort of like I would tend to go for. I think it's difficult though, because the best can be the enemy of the good. I don't think I can reasonably expect half the requirements to be taken away. Um, so we kind of have muddled forward a little bit by injecting a little bit of more computer science into algebra. I think there's a program called Bootstrap, which is part of the algebra curriculum now, and I'm happy about that. And in terms of, like, again, what would I personally do? I've had discussions with the administration for years now about the possibility of like teaching a physics class that has computer science incorporated into it, because I'm credentialed personally in teaching physics as well as computer science and mathematics. So that's something that I would I would love to explore, but there's a limit to how much time a given individual has. I'm kind of just I can kind of do what I can do, but there's a limit to that too.
Sure. Yeah, that's right. And yeah, if you I think if you think about the importance of other subjects that people consider to be quite important nowadays, like English and science, and if you think about computer science, it might be, some people are saying that it could be more important than science classes. Um, so that instead of having science, you still wouldn't completely eliminate science classes like chemistry or physics, but you would like do half of that or less than half and then replace it with computer science. Like that could be a possibility.
I agree that that's one option that could be explored. I think that is a difficult decision. And if you were to ask me for, I kind of outline kind of what I would most strongly recommend, another alternative as someone who's taught geometry before. I think that geometry is an interesting topic because it involves creating the sort of the pinnacle of geometry, which actually is often not even taught because it's so hard, is doing formal proofs about geometry.
Mhm.
And I think that if we could revamp a geometry curriculum so that it becomes very much programming in the same, it take a lot of thought to make it so the same computational concepts, the same intellectual concepts that geometry teaches. So you'd still be teaching what a triangle is, you'd still be teaching side angle side theorems and this sort of thing, but you would be delivering proofs that got delivered would be code that students would write rather than
Oh,
these long formally written proofs that are the teachers hate to grade and the students hate to create. If what you're doing there as a student is you're struggling to write code effectively. So and the advantage is that a computerized version of this writing code that corresponds to a proof is something that a computer can check. The teacher doesn't have to even check it necessarily. And so the bandwidth for learning is much higher in that context. And that's actually kind of been what I've been doing in developing the logic curriculum with Stanford, is where you can create proofs that the proofs. So the structure of a proof can be independent of the content for what geometric shapes are and stuff. And so there's three concepts that then we could coordinate for how we would teach it. There's coding, there's the formal logic proof, and then there's the actual geometry content. And we could create, I envision one day creating a class that kind of combines those three things together. One of the challenges is individual passions. When I talk to the logic experts, they bristle at the idea of coding,
right.
because a proof is a proof. I don't need code to write a proof. And at the same time, though, they're using these computerized proof checkers. So it's not like they're just writing on paper. And a geometry teacher, I've been a geometry teacher, and there's a passion for the beauty of geometry and the connection between geometry and engineering and science, and it's sincerely present. And so how you could craft a class that you'd have, again, there's only so much time in the day, you're going to have to give up something, right? And so that would require that's going to require looking in detail at the curriculum and making some difficult decisions about what you're going to get rid of, but also to be sufficiently informed to be able to make decisions that say, you know what, we may be throwing out the hinge theorem. That's a theorem in geometry, but no one ever uses the hinge theorem in practice. And the conceptual foundation, the concepts that are taught from learning the hinge theorem would also be captured if we were to have students write code that does this rendering activity on a computer for graphics rendering. That requires a lot of work and expertise at the detailed level. It's not something where you can just kind of wave your hand and say, oh, we'll replace geometry with computer science, or we'll replace chemistry with computer science. You can't do it at that level. You have to go down into some details that are beyond a lot of people, especially people in the world of education, ironically enough, because we're talking about understanding technical material. And not a lot of people in the world of education have a lot of technical expertise.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So looks like I ran out of questions, and
Okay.
just wondering if you have any other thing that you probably want to talk about.
I didn't have any like preset agenda. I'm delighted to be able to uh, interact with a student and support you in as you figure out how to navigate these waters. I know that students that you're in and you may have been hearing how unique your situation is, and it is. Um, I can recall different times in my life when an event has happened and it has been described as unique. Um, and only after you get a little distance away from it in time, and you look back on it and you say, that was unusual. um, but often it doesn't seem that unusual in the moment. And so
Yeah.
uh,
Mhm.
it's a common temptation for teachers, especially this time of year. We're approaching graduation for seniors, and you tend to want to give advice, and the advice is usually pretty esoteric. Um, and the best advice I ever got from a teacher or an administrator was when the president of MIT advised us to be careful crossing the street. And that advice still applies. And so if I were to add anything to any conversation with a student at this point in time, it'd be careful crossing the street. And it sounds mundane, and it sounds I don't know, not very visionary, but you each of you is really important, and doing little things like that actually are what makes a difference in everyone's lives. So be careful crossing the street. Eat your vegetables.
Okay. That's great advice.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. I want to thank you again for coming onto the show. I know we've been planning on this for a while, and we wasn't able to do it in the media center because of the lockdown. But if you're interested in coming to do the show again at the media center, then just feel free to contact me. And
Sure, it'd be great to follow up or
uh-huh.
do another show at some point. I'd love to see the media center, and it would be something of a celebration for us to be able to do that.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks again.
All right. Thank you, Brian. Take care now.
Yeah. Take care. Have a good week.
You too.